the speakers are Zainab Usman, who is a research assistant from Blackburn School of Government at the University of Oxford. Next to me is Dr. Marc-Antoine Pérouse de Monclos. Merci. Who is also an associate fellow on the Africa program at Chatham House. To my right is Elizabeth Rushing, who is a West Africa regional analyst at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. I should say now, Dr. Marc-Antoine wrote this book here, Nigeria's Interminable Insurgency, which is available for everyone to look at. And this goes into great detail on Boko Haram. And Elizabeth Rushing has also produced this document, the Multiple Displacement Crisis Overshadowed by Boko Haram, which is produced with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre and the Norwegian Refugee Council. And this is also available for you to have a look at just on the table over there. Just a couple of things about me. I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House here on the Africa programme. I've been working with Chatham House on Nigeria for a few years, and the elections is an issue that kind of fills us with trepidation here, because they're usually quite horrible things to discuss, because they generally have a history of not being particularly nice. But I have to say, this time around, these elections look certainly to be the most open of the lot since 1999. And I'm looking at you, Mr. Mokri, here, because you do a lot of work on social media, and I'm sure you'll appreciate that this time round you've been getting more direct feedback from people in Nigeria and who care about Nigeria. So when politicians leave themselves open to taking responses from the public through social media, people will respond, and I'm sure that you've been getting varying degrees of feedback from people as to how they view the work of the administration and the opposition. So with that in mind, I'll just go through just a couple of housekeeping things. As Lizzie said in the beginning, could you please keep your phones either switched off or on silent? Please feel free to tweet, send messages about the event, but please don't take phone calls in the middle of the event, because it's actually quite rude. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and after that we'll have probably about 15 minutes for questions. We are running a little bit late. We're hoping to finish this event by 1:45. Yeah. So I will start with Zainab. Go ahead, Zainab, 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you, Chatham House, for inviting me to participate in such an important and a timely and very topical subject matter. My brief presentation is based on the work myself and my colleague, Ollie Owen, who was in the previous session, the work we're doing on forecasting trends in the 2015 elections based on an analysis of the results, the voter turnouts, and the results and the voter turnouts of the 2011 elections, and the results. Sorry. So I'm just going to give a brief outline of what I'll be presenting now, just in case I don't have time to go through everything. First of all, I'm going to read out the headline findings of our findings so far. And I'm then going to highlight the importance of incumbency in the political science literature, and also the trends that we have identified in the 2011 elections. Then I'm going to enumerate the assumptions underlining the analysis itself, that is, the assumptions which sort of define the parameters we use for the analysis of the 2011 elections, if that makes sense. And then I'm going to identify the trends that we have observed from the 2011 elections, and then I'm going to sort of identify the sort of the projections we've made for the 2015 elections, and lastly, I will quickly go through the implications and the conclusions. So the headline findings, I'm just going to enumerate them now quickly. First of all, in order to win the presidency in 2015, the successful political party will have to control the majority of Nigeria's 36 state governorships. Secondly, in 2015 elections, half of the state governors will have completed their maximum 2 terms. So state-level elections are likely to be extremely competitive across the country. And this is something that has already been discussed. The elections are going to be very open. Thirdly, of the 28 governorship elections taking place, 18 states, representing about 2/3, will have vacant seats. And 10 of these 18 states have 40.9% of all registered voters. The fourth finding is that the numerical analysis of the 2015 election, of the 2011 elections, which inform the 2015 projections, shows that both the PDP, the ruling People's Democratic Party, and the opposition All Progressives Congress could each secure 17 states in the governorship elections. The fifth finding is that to win a presidential candidate needs an overall majority and at least 25% of the votes in 2/3 of the states in the country. This is a constitutional requirement. On current indications, if President Goodluck Jonathan runs as PDP candidate, he is likely to get an overall majority. However, he may not necessarily get the 1/4 of the vote in 2/3 of the states and the Federal Capital Territory necessary for him to win the election. So he could get a majority, but he may not necessarily win on the first round of elections. Consequently, if voting patterns are similar to the 2011 elections, a runoff election situation is likely. This is something, again, that has been mentioned in the previous session. And this would be a historic first under Nigeria's present electoral system in this Fourth Republic. However, it is important to note that this runoff outcome is likely to be determined by the choice of candidates put up by the opposition or Progressives Congress, and also the issue of power rotation, also known as the zoning. Then also, it is difficult to predict the outcome of this runoff if it does not favor an outright win for the People's Democratic Party. It may further weaken its chances at the subsequent gubernatorial or governorship elections, given that half of the seats are vacant. Presidential elections take place before the governorship elections, and this determines a lot of the dynamics. And then it is also important to note that the 2011 elections are only a useful guide to understanding or forecasting the 2015 elections if conditions stay the same, including INEC's conduct in voter registration and election management. I'll go into this in greater detail. And then lastly, with high incentives for many actors to manipulate the elections, it will be very important for stakeholders in democratic consolidation, whether it's external observers or local civil society and so on, to focus on issues such as registration, but in particular, collation, that is after the votes have been cast, when they're being counted and results are being posted. That is an issue which stakeholders should focus on, which is likely to be very contested in all the states. So what we've done with our analysis, as I mentioned earlier, is that we looked at the 2011 elections, results, turnouts, and voter numbers, and then we tried to use that to forecast the 2015 elections. The thing with that sort of approach is that, first of all, it made us realize how important the 36 state governors and the 36 states are to the presidential elections. And inevitably, it led us to the conclusion, so to speak, that incumbency is a very important factor not just in Nigeria, but obviously in much of sub-Saharan Africa and much of the developing world, actually. So based on this, we conducted a literature review of the political science literature on elections in sub-Saharan Africa, and also we looked at the 2011 elections, and from that, we were able to identify some certain trends which informed the formula we used for the analysis. So first of all, we realized that Nigerian elections conform to the general rule, sort of rule of thumb on elections in sub-Saharan Africa, that when incumbents run for election, they win over 85% of the time, and typically with 60% of the votes. Actually, in 2011, 17 of Nigeria's 20 incumbent state governors got re-elected, which represents exactly 85%, and they won with an average winning vote of 69%. And then secondly, based on this margin of victory, we realized that it was actually similar for both governors, for both governors in the national ruling PDP, the national ruling party, or whether they were governors from the opposition party. The basic point was that incumbency was the most important thing at the local level. Thirdly, any candidate contesting for a vacant governorship is more likely to win, and by a larger margin, if they are from the same party as the previous incumbent. Again, highlighting the importance of incumbency. So based on these trends that we identified, we derived the formula which we use for our analysis, which I'll get to shortly. But it's also important to mention that we do acknowledge that there are some weaknesses with our methodology, namely that we relied just on one set of elections results, which is the 2011 elections. But obviously there are reasons for that. They are so far the most credible, relatively, since the transition to electoral rule in Nigeria in 1999. They're the most reliable numbers that we can use right now. So the assumptions, I'll list them very quickly. These assumptions sort of define the parameters for our analysis, and they are obviously open to debate, and it is also important to note that the usefulness of the 2011 elections results are contingent on whether these assumptions remain or whether they change significantly. So there are 7 of them. The first is that there will be elections in 2015. I mean, this seems like a no-brainer, but then things could change, right? I mean, the state of emergency is one factor. Another factor is it could be some sort of constitutional amendment, even though it might seem unlikely, but it could happen. Second is that INEC remains committed to running free and fair elections. And obviously, this is something that Professor Kuna has already discussed in the last session. Third is that improvements made in 2011 will remain and restrict rigging to the post-collation process, as opposed to the situation in the past in terms of ballot box stuffing, excessive violence and things like that. Fourth is that the 2015 elections will be an overwhelmingly two-party race between the national ruling People's Democratic Party and the All Progressives Congress. Even though there are still some other parties in existence, a lot of them tend to cleave to one of the two parties. So the LP, the Labour Party, or the APGA, for instance, they're all PDP-leaning parties, effectively. The fifth assumption is that presidential elections will take place before the governorship elections. And this is actually a fundamental assumption, because if the situation were to be reversed, our projections would change considerably. And I will explain that a bit later. The sixth assumption is that the PDP candidate will be President Goodluck Jonathan, whereas the APC is likely to select a northern Muslim candidate. The primaries for the APC, at least the presidential primaries, are taking place tomorrow. They're taking place tomorrow. And there are 4 contenders. There is General Muhammadu Buhari, who has run for about, this is going to be the 4th time he is running. There is former Vice President Atiku Abubakar. There is Kano State Governor Rabi Musa Kwankwaso, and there is there's a publisher of a national newspaper, and then another state governor from the southeast. And then the 7th assumption is that election security management will reflect that of 2011, in which there was improved security. And then there are other factors as well, such as turnouts, which if they're low, they could favor election manipulators and riggers. Money, how money is used and deployed and mobilized. And then also whether the political parties would rely on policy campaigning, policy messages to campaign, or whether they would rely on identity politics. Now, going to the 2011 elections results analysis. Okay. I'll just go through this very, very quickly. So this is the table. Probably in the Q&A session, we could discuss this. We could discuss it further. So there were elections in 25. There were elections in 20. Well, results were announced in 25 states. Let's just leave it at that. And out of those 25 states, 20 states had incumbents running for re-election, while 5 states had open elections. Out of those 20 states with incumbents, 17 of the incumbents got re-elected with a share of 69%, while the other 8 states had non-incumbents winning the elections. Out of those 8 states, in 3 states, opposition candidates defeated the incumbents who were running for re-election, and in 5 of the states, candidates won empty seats, where in 3 of the states, the winning candidates came from the immediate ruling party, previous ruling party, and in 2 of the states, the winning candidates came from the immediately previous opposition parties. So anyways, okay, I have just 2 minutes. The observations here are that incumbency matters, whether you're running for, whether you're trying to defeat an incumbent or whether you're contesting in an open election. And this is what we used to analyze, to forecast trends in the 2015 elections. So coming to 2015, there are 28 governorship elections taking place out of the 36 states. So out of these 28 governorship elections, 10 of the states have incumbents contesting for a second term, while 18 will have open elections because there are vacant seats. And out of these 10 states where incumbents are contesting for a second term, based on our analysis, we actually applied the first formula, which is that across Africa, incumbents tend to win re-elections 80% of the time. And based on our analysis, we think that the APC would end up with 6 states and the PDP would end up with 4 states, whereas they previously had 7 and 3 states respectively. And then for the 18 vacant seats, we applied the formula derived from our analysis of the 2011 elections, in which the ruling party, the PDP, and the opposition parties cumulatively got 60 60% and 40% of the seats respectively. And based on this analysis, we think that the APC will end up with 8 states and the PDP will end up with 10 states. And when we add these states that each of the parties will get, along with the states that are not going to have elections, we think that the PDP will end up with 21 states, and the APC will end up with 17 states. Sorry, the PDP will end up with 19 states, and the APC will end up with 17. This is a departure from the number of states they currently control each, where the PDP currently has 22 states and the APC has okay. So let me just quickly conclude with the projections for the presidential elections. That first of all, going by the first formula in which we think that incumbents are likely to win 80% of the time, President Goodluck Jonathan of the PDP has a chance of winning the elections just based on that, but we think that is an insufficient explanation. So using the second formula, we think that when we look at how we think states are going to vote in the governorship elections, where the PDP controls 19 states, will end up with 19 states, and the APC will end up with 17 states. We think that there is likely to be a runoff, precisely because even though the PDP may end up with the majority number of states, they might not necessarily obtain the minimum 25% of registered voters required from 2/3 of the states across the country. And I can go into detail on that during the Q&A session because I'm clearly out of time. I would just like to conclude on the note that while incumbency is very, very important, particularly in Nigeria, as I have highlighted earlier on, this really depends on not just what happens at the level of the states, but then this is also informed by specific local factors, such as the candidates, the local political coalitions, the party machineries and structures, the electorate sophistication, the candidates' grasp of key issues and how they engage with the electorate as well. So I'll just conclude on that note. Anything else we can discuss in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Marc-Antoine?
Thank you very much.
15 minutes starting now.
15 minutes, right. And thank you to Chatham House for inviting me here. And 15 minutes, I will try to restrict myself to this period of time. I'm the male minority here, and my chair is very strict on time, so I'll definitely have to stop after 15 minutes. So it means that in this period of time, I will not have time to analyze properly Boko Haram, the Jama'atu, listen a little what it was jihad, where it comes from, where it's going to, and what it stands for. For this, I would refer, of course, to the report for Chatham House, as well as the book we've done with Nigerian colleagues. It's going to be, it's now on reprint in the US, so I've left some flyers there, and the access to the book will be easier as it used to be. So that's enough for advertisement. So I will just focus on, as I was asked to do, on the possible impact of Boko Haram on the coming elections. So I will not say a word about the international dimensions of Boko Haram, its regional impact, or the asymmetric war opposing insurgents to the Nigerian army. I will just say a word about the propaganda war that has to do with Boko Haram, and I will articulate my presentation in two parts. First, I'd like to say a word about the way Boko Haram contributes to framing the narratives of the competing parties for the coming elections. And two, I would like to, and that would have to do with guesstimates, I must say, I would like to see how possibly Boko Haram could influence the vote also. So let me start the first part with a provocative question. who benefits from the crime? Who benefits from the crisis? Is it the opposition or the government? And strangely enough, I would say both. Clearly, the opposition took advantage of the crisis to show how the government is weak, and how even Boko Haram crisis also revealed the corruption in some Nigerian institutions like the army. So of course, it plays in favor of the opposition. And the mediatization of the Chibok kidnapping of the girls also helped the opposition to portray the government as being incompetent. And in this regard, the Boko Haram crisis, yes, indeed, plays in favor of the opposition. The Chibok, for instance, affair in the international media went up to the stage whereby Nigeria was portrayed as a failed or a collapsed state. That's something I would not agree with, clearly. But this helps to show that, yes, there is a problem with the current government, so there is a need for change. And even the recent declarations of the Emir of Kano or the Sultan of Sokoto show how the Boko Haram crisis interferes with the elections, in the sense that both of them complain about the government incapacity, inability to tackle the issue properly, to contain the insurgents. One could expect that from the Emir of Kano, who was the former governor of the central bank, well, you know his story, so you wouldn't expect much support from him. But the Sultan of Sokoto was seen as the key man for the incumbent president to get some votes in the Muslim North, or the way it's seen as being Muslim. And his recent declaration in this regard, or awarding a title to Tambuwal, who had just defected from the PDP, was clearly a sign that, yes, Boko Haram crisis helps to frame the narratives of the opposition that something has to be done and the current government is not able to do it. So you should vote for somebody else. Now, I don't think that Boko Haram only plays in favor of the opposition. There are 3 points where I see that Boko Haram is also helping the government to try to raise some votes. First of all, the government has often blamed the opposition for backing Boko Haram, portraying people like Buhari as being a jihadist, even if, after all, during the last elections, Buhari, number 2 on his ticket, was a pastor who used to be a Muslim, and of course, this is apostasy for the jihadist group. So it shows that, well, maybe Buhari is not as much a jihadist as portrayed, but anyway, Boko Haram is seen as being backed by Muslim stalwarts in the north, and that helps the government to raise some support elsewhere. It clearly helps also the government to mobilize the Christian lobby. And also, as you said, the incumbency factor plays a role. We have a say in French, for instance, you shouldn't change a horse in the middle of the river. So if Nigeria is facing a crisis, you'd better stay with the same man, whether he's a Christian or a Muslim. But yes, clearly there is also a Christian lobby in Nigeria. We know that the President Goodluck Jonathan is close to Pastor Ayo, the leader of CAN, the Christian Association of Nigeria. President Goodluck Jonathan went to do the pilgrimage in Jerusalem, and he was recently in the Vatican. That plays in favor of portraying the crisis as being a kind of Muslim conspiracy against a Christian president. And that helps to raise votes in Christian constituencies that would support President Goodluck Jonathan. I'm thinking, of course, about the Niger Delta, but also the Middle Belt, as well as the Igbo land, possibly. So, yes, Boko Haram also helps to frame the crisis as being a Muslim jihad, a revival of the jihad of Usman and Fodio. That creates a lot of fear that could possibly play in favor of the incumbent government. There's a third point, which is also very important, and that's very much perceived this way in the north. That's the issue of the emergency rule in the northeast, in the 3 states, which are seen as backing the opposition, even if recently In Adamawa, there was an impeachment, and now the governor is pro-PDP. But clearly, the idea is that these 3 states would vote for the opposition and not for the incumbent government. Now, you all know the electoral rule whereby to win the elections, a president must win at least 25% of the votes in 2/3 of the states. So, of course, if you eliminate, if there are no elections, and Professor Kuna explained that this is up to INEC to decide at the last moment, but if there are no elections in these 3 states, which are supposed to vote for the opposition, then it would support the incumbent president and his possibility to be re-elected and get the 25% of votes in not 24 states, but 23. So that would help him clearly to vote if there is no vote, to win the elections if there is no vote in the Northeast. But of course, if there is no vote in the Northeast, it would be a triumph for Boko Haram and for Abubakar Shekau, or what remains of Abubakar Shekau. And because it would help them, that they despise democracy, parliamentarian regime, which is seen as incompatible with the Islamic way of life. And of course, if there are no votes in the Northeast, that would be a victory for the insurgents. Now, let's see how Boko Haram could also influence the vote in this regard. And my concern is not only on the killing fields, on the victims of this insurgency and the military repression in the Northeast, and these killings go up to Kano and sometimes even up to Abuja. My concern is also that there is a widening, a growing gap, a development gap between the North and the South. The economic growth of Nigeria is very much in the South, whereas the business is quite dead in the North. People don't want to invest, or they would even divest from the North. So clearly there are 2 Nigeria now. And if you are in Lagos, 1,200 kilometers away from Maiduguri, clearly you are on another planet. And this widening gap is quite scary for me, I must say. What I mean here is that the perception of Boko Haram in the South is clearly very, very different from the perception of Boko Haram in the North. In the South, Boko Haram was described as, at one stage, it was seen as an IBB conspiracy or just name them, a conspiracy anyway, against a Christian president. And it is seen also as the revival of the jihad of Usman and Fodio, with a big plan to Islamize the whole of Nigeria. Of course, in the North, this vision is very, very different. The Boko Haram crisis, the expansion of Boko Haram, is seen as the result of a lack of political will to really tackle this issue. And maybe even as a punishment for people in Borno who did not vote for Goodluck Jonathan in 2011. So the idea is that if Boko Haram develops, it has not to do only with corruption in the army, or it has also much to do with the lack of political will as a way to kill the North, in a way. That's how it's framed. And of course, there's the issue of oil. Unlike Mend in the Niger Delta, that does produce oil, and where the government of Umaru Yar'Adua accepted the principle of an amnesty in 2009, no such thing was achieved regarding Boko Haram. But of course, the economic leverage of Boko Haram on the government is much lower because there's no oil in Borno. Whereas when you are fighting in the Niger Delta and you can halve the production, the oil production that feeds the government, 95% of the budget government is coming from the oil and gas industry, then clearly it means that these rebel groups have an advantage to force the government to negotiate, whereas Boko Haram does not have this advantage. So to me, Boko Haram will play an important role in the voting patterns in 2015 during the next elections. It will trigger indeed some, the religion will play a role, not everywhere. For instance, I'm not so much convinced that in the Southwest, religion would be so much of an issue to determine the vote. But yes, in some places like the Middle Belt, or even possibly in the Niger Delta, the religion issue will be very important and will partly determine the voting patterns of the Nigerian citizen. But, and that's an important point, Boko Haram will not be the only issue people will vote for. Issues like the oil industry, the fall of the price of barrel, or the fact that there is divestment from Shell or others, corruption will also be some of the issues that Nigerian citizens will vote about, especially in the south. Very far away from the Borno killing fields, my feeling, it's just a feeling, I cannot prove it, but my feeling is that the more distant you are from the killing fields of Boko Haram, the more important, the more salient other issues become. And these issues have to do indeed with performance, corruption, basic services, health, access to health, to education, electricity, of course, which is still a major problem in many parts of Nigeria. So to sum up, and I will really be strict with my timing, I would say that religion and the fear of Boko Haram will play a role during the next elections, but not everywhere. It will play a role clearly in the northeast, if there are elections in the northeast. It will play a role in the north, yes, in general. It will play a role in the middle belt, possibly in the Niger Delta. In the southeast, I don't really know. And in the southwest, I don't know also. I presume that some other issues are as important for the voters. And that's my second point. I mean, we should not read Nigeria only through the prism of jihadism and Boko Haram. There are many other important issues in these coming elections. Corruption, the oil industry, for instance. And the third point has indeed to do with the militarization of the elections. That's a point that was raised in the first panel. That's very important, clearly. And there's one point here that I cannot answer, so I'm just raising the question as a kind of open conclusion. Does the current government really control the army? That's an issue that we should take account into the next elections. Thank you.
Timing. In fact, you're even 20 seconds short.
Oh!
So, you have an extra 20 seconds, Elizabeth. Go ahead. 15 minutes starting now.
Thank you, Sola, and thank you to Chatham House for organizing this very timely and relevant event, and thank you to the other panelists for their very helpful insight. I'd like today to first place the elections that we've spoken about all morning into a wider context of insecurity and forced displacement. IDMC has been monitoring forced displacement in Nigeria since 1998, 1 year before the country's return to civilian rule. Secondly, I'd like to then briefly outline the humanitarian concerns that we're seeing in the run-up to presidential elections in February, and the challenges that actors in country are trying to address in terms of the inclusion of IDPs in the electoral processes. And lastly, I'd like to have us take a step back and look at a couple of underlying institutional constraints that must be addressed in order to prevent displacement and secure durable solutions for those already displaced, namely challenges in data collection and also gaps in Nigeria's legal framework. And as Sola mentioned, this is all well cataloged in our report, which we're releasing today here. Multiple displacement crises overshadowed by Boko Haram, which is available on the table to your right. So first, why are people forced to flee their homes in Nigeria? I believe I had a map available, if that's still the case. Thank you. While Boko Haram-related violence does continue to dominate international attention, the list is unfortunately long of other causes of internal displacement in Nigeria. Intercommunal clashes fueled by ethnic and religious tensions flare on a near weekly basis throughout Nigeria's Middle Belt, which is a wide region throughout the center of the country, roughly dividing the Muslim North and the Christian South. Data is very limited in this regard, but hundreds of thousands of people are estimated to have been displaced in this region as violence has increased over the last 15 years. Conflicts in this Middle Belt region are fueled by myriad factors, including ethno-religious disputes, criminality, cattle rustling, land disputes, and tensions between pastoralists and farmers. Intercommunal violence was the biggest factor causing displacement in Nigeria, in fact, until about 6 months ago. And while we don't have any quantitative evidence, we currently believe from sources on the ground that displacement caused by Boko Haram and intercommunal violence are roughly equal. Nigeria is also prone to seasonal flooding, which you'll see represented in blue on the map, which in 2012 caused the world's second largest disaster-induced displacement event of the year, affecting 33 of Nigeria's 36 states. You can also see represented on the map across the northern region, the state authorities' their recent recognition that thousands of people have been internally displaced as a result of desertification. Also in the cities of Abuja, Port Harcourt, and Lagos, more than 2 million slum dwellers and other marginalized people have been forcibly evicted from their homes over the last 10 years. Political or election-related violence has also forced people to flee, as we've discussed today. Following the last presidential elections in April 2011, IDMC counted nearly 65,000 people were displaced over a period of 3 days of violent protests across 12 northern states. And the last cause of internal displacement I'll talk about, and the reason that many of us are here today, is the increase in attacks and abductions by insurgent group Boko Haram, as outlined by Marc-Antoine, which has uprooted and ripped apart families throughout the Northeast, a region roughly the size of Greece. In the last 6 months in particular, Boko Haram has not only scaled up their brutal attacks, which are now almost exclusively against civilians, but they have also been aggressively taking over towns and establishing their presence in the form of a caliphate. This has created an unprecedented protection crisis in northeastern Nigeria. The insurgency has reportedly forced 1.5 million people to flee to other parts of the country as of September of 2014, and at least another 150,000, but likely closer to 180,000 Nigerians have fled externally, as we've spoken about this morning, in neighboring Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. These are often surprise attacks, which means huge numbers of people flee their homes and villages with nothing, leaving with literally the shirts on their backs, and abandoning identifying documents, including, most notably for today, their voter registration cards. The group has also abducted at least 500 women and girls in northeastern Nigeria since 2009. And large-scale abductions, such as those we saw in Chibok, have escalated since earlier this year. Such tactics constitute a serious abuse of human rights, as well as a most literal form of forced displacement. And people also fear abduction as a key factor, underscoring their decision to flee. It's also important to note here that the Nigerian government has been accused of using heavy-handed tactics that cause further displacement, including the extrajudicial killing of perhaps 600 suspected militants, disappearances, the razing of property in communities thought to harbor Boko Haram fighters. Regardless of why people flee, IDPs face a range of threats to their physical safety once they're on the move. Boko Haram's proclamation of a caliphate in Adamawa and Borno states has trapped people inside these areas, and we're hearing reports of summary executions of those seeking to flee. As Boko Haram and the security forces fight to control main roads, fleeing civilians are often forced into forested areas where many have lost their way and died of hunger and thirst. They also risk being mistaken by the security forces for militants. Some people displaced in the Northeast make their way to camps set up and operated by the SEMAs, the State Emergency Management Agencies, with the support of the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, and other international partners. There are now 12 official IDP camps in Borno State and 6 in Adamawa State. At least 4 of these have opened up in the last few weeks, which reflects the recent influx of IDPs in these areas. Those IDPs who reside in or live near camps receive some assistance, but they don't often have access to sufficient nutritional food, essential household items like mosquito nets and kitchen kits, proper sanitation and hygiene, or health facilities. The majority of IDPs, however, never make it into a formal camp. Some are turned away because the camps are overcrowded. Others are too afraid to enter the camps and hide out in remote villages. Many people end up sleeping under trees, in abandoned churches and school buildings, or in empty fields. Most IDPs live with and share the resources of host communities, often in cities where they don't know anyone and their rural livelihoods are essentially useless. And these people are tough to find and help. It's not like the logistics of a mass distribution in a camp. Recent improvements in data collection have led to an improved understanding of displacement patterns, 3 of which IDMC has identified in past months. 1, people are fleeing from the 3 northeastern states to the neighboring states of Bauchi, Gombe, and Taraba, and to central Nigeria and the Middle Belt region. As you can see on the map, the overlapping causes of other types of displacement there. This increases competition for resources between IDPs and host communities in flashpoint areas in particular. 2, people tend to flee from rural to urban areas within their home states. This increases population stress on towns and cities and raises further security concerns. And 3, IDPs and host communities are affected by violence and a lack of access to basic needs, including food and water, which forces them to flee into a second or even third cycle of displacement. This ongoing depletion of resources increases IDPs' vulnerability with each cycle of displacement. So what does this mean for elections that we've spoken about today? First, I would like to put into context why IDPs are relevant to the presidential elections. According to Professor Kuna this morning, there are currently 70 million registered voters in Nigeria. Now, assuming that even a third of the current estimate of 3.3 million IDPs in the country, and please note that 3.3 million is reflective of all causes of displacement. So assuming that even a third of the estimated 3.3 million IDPs throughout the country would be eligible voters, we're talking about between 1.5 and 2% of the voting population who are currently living in displacement and may not have access to a polling unit. Elections have been won or lost by smaller margins. The African Union Kampala Convention on Internal Displacement, which Nigeria ratified in 2012, legally binds Nigeria to provide for IDPs' participation in elections. As we've discussed this morning, however, there have been challenges in establishing the proper system for IDPs' voter registration to be transferred for their areas of origin to their areas of displacement. INEC has argued that an amendment to the 2010 Electoral Act is required to allow IDPs to register to vote in their areas of displacement. If this does not happen before February, and I'm not much more encouraged after the conversation this morning that it will, it is likely that these millions of voters will be disenfranchised. So let's unpack that just for a moment. In order for IDPs to vote in the upcoming elections, we need to see an amendment to the Electoral Act. We need to register the IDPs in their places of displacement, and then they need to get to a polling booth or a voting point, as we're hearing about today. The chances of this happening are indeed quite slim. Again, not only is the right of IDPs to participate in political affairs an obligation of the Nigerian government made when they ratified the Kampala Convention, but the disenfranchisement of millions of voters could severely undermine any democratic process and could put into question the ultimate results. We may need to start thinking about exceptional circumstances, particularly if there's a runoff election. On top of this, there are fears of new displacement before and during the elections. A contingency planning process has identified 16 states as potential hotspots for political-related violence, with widespread displacement anticipated in many states in northern Nigeria. Elections are also likely to exacerbate ongoing conflict in the Northeast region, as well as intercommunal violence throughout the Middle Belt. So what is the way forward here? Through our monitoring, IDMC has focused our attention and efforts in the last 5 years on 2 significant institutional gaps that, if not addressed, will continue to hinder prevention of and stunt response to all forms of displacement, not just those caused by Boko Haram. The first is problems in collecting data and information on the numbers and needs of people fleeing violence. Cumulative figures for internal displacement, as I mentioned earlier, are currently provided by the National Commission for Refugees, which in February of this year reported that there were 3.3 million IDPs in the country as of end 2013. However, this figure was based largely on secondary sources and used an unclear methodology. Other agencies which collect stats on displacement, such as NEMA, tend to do so only after large crises, which is really only the tip of the iceberg. It's really only in affected areas affected by Boko Haram that we've seen better data collection, leading to an improved understanding of displacement patterns. And even with this arguably disproportionate attention, data collection on the numbers and needs of IDPs are questionable and undercut confidence in relief efforts. For national agencies, humanitarian organizations, and donors, the situation begs the question: how long can we tolerate basing our response to growing needs in Nigeria on outdated and unreliable estimates? The reality is that the full scale and impact of internal displacement in Nigeria has always been unclear, in part because data collection has never been prioritized, but also because mandates between various government structures are yet to be clarified by national policy on internal displacement. Which brings me to my second institutional gap, namely that while Nigeria did ratify the Kampala Convention on Internal Displacement in 2012, and shortly thereafter rewrote a draft policy on internal displacement to incorporate its provisions, we're now more than 2 years on, and the Federal Executive Council has yet to adopt that policy, and we're likely to see an adoption in the next 2 months. Unlikely, sorry. These two institutional deficiencies create two interrelated problems. Without proper data, there will always be an alarming lack of understanding of the country's displacement dynamics. And without the proper framework, namely a domestication of the Kampala Convention, there will never be clearly defined roles and responsibilities with regard to internal displacement. This leads, without fail, to response efforts that are fragmented and generally inadequate. If the forecast that we're hearing today for February elections is close, then it's more important now than ever to adopt a more holistic approach, one that starts with a solid understanding of numbers and needs of IDPs, that gets them to the polls in February, and that supports them in their search for durable solutions to their displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We will be taking some questions in a second. If you could, okay, I'll come to it. If you could state who you are and your affiliation quite clearly, and please just try and keep it to a question, if possible, no sweeping statements. Yeah. I'll just let Mr. Omokri make his point first, and then we'll go around the room and take some questions. Okay, can we take this one from here?
Thank you. My name is Rana Omokri, Special Assistant to President Goodluck Jonathan. And I believe while Zainab was speaking, she said there's a high incentive for actors to manipulate results. Now, I want to state clearly that that's not the case with the president and with this administration. Several of the actors, several of the aspirants have made statements publicly that have called for bloodshed and violence. The president has never done so. He has consistently said, my ambition is not worth the blood of any Nigerian. He said that most recently on the 11th of November. So that is something that is absent with the president and this administration. Also, on the 14th of October, I had...
Sorry, do you have a question?
No, it's a comment,
Okay,
and it's going to be
short.
short.
Just keep it very brief,
Okay, I'll be
Thank
brief.
you.
I had to ask Mark Antoine, because on page 33 of the document he gave to you, you'd see where he said President Goodluck Jonathan is particularly divisive. And I challenged him. I said, what parameters did you use to come to that conclusion? And then he told me on record that that wasn't a statement of fact, that it was a perception based on some of the conversations he'd had with people in the Northeast. Now, I would appreciate it if you restate that. And then finally, just 30 seconds.
Very, very quickly.
Yeah, very
please.
quickly. Now, a point has been raised about the military and talking about corruption and stuff like that. You have to understand, Amnesty International, some members of the opposition, and various groups have made allegations. And you know, our military have been able to prepare for conventional war. They have a good record for that, but they've never been able to prepare for terrorism. And they need new weapons. They can't use conventional means on terrorists. And the Leahy law in the United States has prevented the United States from selling those kinds of weapons to our military. But of late, we've been finding out ways to go about that, and that's why you've been seeing that there's been a recent improvement, but with our military in containing Boko Haram insurgencies. Thank you very much.
I'd like to make a personal challenge to you on that. I think a lot of the criticism from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other human rights organisations has been of the military tactics towards civilians when they've been going trying to find terrorists.
Well, it might be, but the Leahy law just states that when such allegations have been made, the United States, which has chiefly been our major supplier, can't supply those kinds of regimes. And that's why we've been working on that. We're not saying there's no problem. You're dealing with a violent group. So sometimes, I mean, it's very difficult. So we're working on that. But while we're working on that, we're finding other ways to make sure that our military is armed. Thank you very much.
Okay, right. You asked a question before, Gaba. I will come back to you if we have enough time, but I'd like to give somebody else a chance. The gentleman in the corner behind the man with the red jacket.
Afternoon. My name is Judy Warner from Tekavi Consulting. I just want to say it's a really excellent panel. I enjoyed all your contributions. I have, in a good Nigerian sense, questions to a comment. The first thing is the links between IDPs and election violence. In essence, if you look at the patterns of the IDPs and of the violence, it does fit, particularly not just in the Boko Haram states, but also in the Middle Belt, Southern Kaduna, Nasarawa. It matches not so much tribal and religious, disputes of old, and that has a massive. And also the voting patterns in those areas are, as has been alluded to by Zainab, are more to do with identity politics than actual policy. So the key question in this from that is, what are the links, or has your research generated any links showing, as Dr. Monclos said, who benefits from it? Who does benefit from this election violence? Because the IDPs will not vote, so somebody is going to win, and we can see from somebody somewhere is benefiting from it. So would you say it's deliberate or not? And then just following on from that, in terms of, I'm just going to respond to Mr. Omokri and his, the United States is not our key weapons supplier. The key weapons supplier has been Russia and China. The issues relating to Nigeria and our military and everything, and it's also in response to your final question or statement about who controls the military. The military is controlled by the government as of right now. We have a lot of issues in terms of our human rights, and the problem is not that we have these issues. The problem is that we're not doing anything about it. If we responded to Amnesty International, to Human Rights Watch, to all these people, they would go away. Oh, okay, they won't go away, but they would at least calm down. We don't respond. There has been no investigation, no arrests, no prosecutions. The mutiny soldiers have been convicted. The people who executed Mohammed Yusuf have not been convicted. Yeah. This is the problem, sir, with respect.
Okay,
so that is the problem that we have. And this is something I'm saying so that you can pass it back to your principal. We don't all hate the government. We don't all hate Jonathan. We just want Nigeria to be good. So then back to your principal.
We will invite Renaud Mokri or somebody who represents Goodluck Jonathan to speak at a later date. Can we just deal with the panel at the moment? So the question was who actually directly benefits from the electoral violence in terms of IDPs not being allowed to vote?
Yes, I'll try to take that. And as Marc-Antoine also said, and perhaps you can add to this, I think that both sides could construe the violence to their own causes. But I'd also like to underline that in general, religion and ethnicity in our research have been politically manipulated for populist causes in the past and also in today's climate. Ethnicity in particular has played a significant role in religious conflicts in northern Nigeria, like where sectarian groups have exploited tensions between Hausa and Fulani settlers, or Hausa settlers and Fulani and indigene. But in our research, we're finding that the religious dimension may be misconstrued as a primary driver of violence, where in reality, disenfranchisement and inequality are rather the primary drivers.
Would you like to add to that?
Yes, on the Christian bias of Goodluck Jonathan, and thank you for refreshing my memory because yes, we already had this discussion on one of my elements of answer was not only on the way Goodluck Jonathan is perceived by Muslims in the north, but also regarding the fact that he only went once to Maiduguri, for instance. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any other Christian president of Nigeria going on official pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Which is not a religious duty unlike the Muslims for Mecca. So that was a clear symbol of somebody who is indeed suspected of having a Christian bias. I won't go too much into details on the relationship with Khan
If we have time.
and on that issues, but the official pilgrimage to Jerusalem for me was a signal indeed.
Okay, any other questions, please?
Can I?
Oh, sorry, Zainab.
Yeah, just to Mr. Omokri's comment on the fact that he thinks President Jonathan has restated his commitment to peaceful elections, and there's really limited incentive to rig, quote unquote, or manipulate the elections. I think when we look at what happened in Ekiti State or Osun State, the militarization of those elections, people would argue differently, that there is indeed a high incentive to, even if it's not to directly rig the elections, but to control the outcomes as much as possible. And also, as Dr. Monclos mentioned, not just going on religious pilgrimage, but also making policy statements in church, appealing to a certain demographic or certain religious group in Nigeria is something to consider.
I'm sorry. We need to take other questions. You can respond to it at the end. I'm trying to avoid this becoming a big kind of Renaud mockery versus the audience discussion, because that's not really why we're here. And also, a lot of the opinions that people on here have expressed are either based on the ground data or personal opinion. It's all very subjective. So if we keep responding to what is actually somebody's opinion or what is somebody's perception, and I think it can turn into something quite futile and kind of moving away from why we're really here. So I will take a question from this gentleman behind you, just here. It's you, sir, with the green tie.
Hi, yeah, sure. Just a very quick question, Lanray, and an investment advisor. I think I'm just trying to get to facts and figures here. So if we have 70 million registered voters, does anyone on the panel have an idea of what the percentage split between the North and the South is of that number? And the reason why is, does that, if my sense is correct with the population of the South, etc., does that make the South the key battleground and Jonathan's posturing? Just a thought, really.
Okay. Would anybody like to take that?
Yeah.
I don't have the data. I'm next.
Okay. So, in our analysis, again, this is based on the 2011 voter figures. While I really don't have the data right now to tell you the distribution between the North and the South, but what we found out was that 10 of the 18 states that will have open elections, open governorship elections where there are no incumbents running, have 40% of the registered voters. So that's something to think about. Perhaps the issue then is not really the regional distribution of voters, but probably the distribution across states depending on their party allegiances. So that's one thing. Another thing, again, is that 2 of the states with the highest number of registered voters, again, based on the 2011 figures, are Lagos and Kano. Lagos has 6.1 million registered had 6.1 million registered voters, and Kano has 5 million registered voters. So for now, I can't really tell you the regional distribution, but it might be important to think of it in terms of party allegiances.
Okay, I'll take the next round of questions in maybe 3, and we will give you a chance to come back on that because it's actually quite important. So the gentleman there with the grey jacket, and and then followed by you at the front here with the brown lapel, and by Professor Kuna.
Sorry, Najim Animashan. I'm an energy consultant. And I want to explore this point a little bit further with you, Zainab. Given that Lagos and Kano are such key states, and both of them have retiring governors and will have new governors coming in, how much will that skew your research? How much have they skewed your research in that respect? And of the 10 of the 18, how many of those states involve the Northwest and the Southwest? And thirdly, with Kano specifically, given that the largest number, according to the Kano state government officials that I talked to, the largest number of IDPs that are moving across either come to Kano or to Abuja if they go across country. I could be wrong, Elizabeth, but there's a large number of IDPs moving into Kano. How will that affect the vote or skew the vote in Kano when it comes to these elections?
Okay, gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Lagun Akiloye. I am a political analyst about Nigeria and also an executive member of the Central Association of Nigerians in the UK. My first question is to Zainab. There's lots of talk about the APC fielding a Muslim candidate, Muslim ticket, the whole general issue about ethnic politics in Nigeria. I enjoyed the whole aspect of what is a forecast and predictions. When do you think Nigeria will progress to the state where merit overrules ethnic diversity and tensions? When will a man get chosen based on what he can do rather than where he is from?
Excellent question. Excellent question.
Thank you. Second question is for Elizabeth. From your point of view, what are the three things that Nigeria are lacking in terms of how they actually help people who are displaced, in terms of flooding and Boko Haram? How do they help, and what three things do you think need to be improved on to ensure that people are taken care of in situations like these?
Okay, and Professor Kuna.
Thank you. I would like to address my question to Mark. And this is just related to the possible, in the event that there is no election in the Northeast, what kinds of legal complications might arise, in terms of the declaration of results, I think the question is still open because we need to look at what the Commission does in the event that it is advised that elections cannot take place. If elections are postponed, then in the Northeast, then it is a legal requirement for the Commission at the time it postpones the election to announce a new date for an election. But if elections are suspended, and this may appear like a play of on words, but it has huge legal significance on the operations. If elections are suspended, then the question is open as to whether the possible votes that can be garnered by all parties from the Northeast can or cannot be used for the election. If it is a suspension. If it is a postponement, a new date for an election has to be announced, and which means therefore there cannot be a declaration of result, from the other states.
Okay, so the first question was for Zainab, and that was the Lagos-Kano question. They both have retiring governors. How much has that skewed your research? And how many of the 18 states that have vacant seats? Was it vacant seats or?
10 of the 18 states that represent 40% of the electorate you mentioned are in the Northwest, and the Southwest.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. So the first question, and this is something we have reflected on in our analysis, the fact that incumbency still is a major factor, even where there will be open elections, open seat elections like Lagos and Kano, where the incumbents are retiring. But then, importantly, again, it's it's good to remember that Lagos and Kano have historically been the hotbed of progressive, quote unquote, or opposition politics. I mean, take Lagos, for instance. Since 1999, it has always been an opposition state in terms of the kind of governor it produces and the governor's party affiliation. Kano has varied a little bit, but it has also been a hotbed of opposition politics. But also, I would say that, again, this is something that I touched on briefly, but it's something we looked at in our analysis. The fact that ultimately local issues matter a lot. So take Kano, for instance. The choice of candidate that the APC puts forward would determine whether the APC would get re-elected in February or not. The same thing with Lagos. And currently, I think a lot of people are a bit skeptical of the APC's chances in both states, given the caliber of candidates that have been put forward vis-a-vis those that have been put forward by the PDP. So the other question on IDPs, to be honest, it's very difficult to say. I mean, the IDPs, I really don't know much about the IDPs in Kano, and it could, yeah, you want to say something?
A lot of the Okada drivers,
Yeah.
basically IDPs who are eking out a living being transported. And they are a hugely significant portion of the get out the vote in Kano on election day, where basically the getting out the vote money matters to them. And when you have, I don't know, say a couple of 100,000, and the government is aware that there's a couple of 100,000 of those people, it may put them into play. Again, it may go to your voter manipulation or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, you've got this quote-unquote electoral asset available to those who are ready to use it, and the desperation of those people who are displaced to be willing tools. I'm not talking necessarily in terms of electoral violence here. But in Kano, that may make a significant difference because they are not from Kano per se, but they are as Elizabeth was saying, if you're talking about 1.5% to 2% of the Kano voting population being these people, it can make a significant difference. But one of the reasons why I asked you that question was this. No president has ever won the presidency without winning either Lagos or Kano. And currently it looks like they're going to lose both. So the question is, of those 40% of the electorate, how many are there in the northwest and the southwest? Because Kano and Lagos are pull factors for both of those regions.
Do you have any figures on that?
Okay, I don't have the figures now, but I could send them to you later. I mean, I didn't come with a breakdown now.
Okay, the other question, sorry, Zainab, was from the Central Association of Nigeria, and that is, when will Nigeria see a president or politicians elected purely on meritocracy rather than what part of the country they come from, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Kanuri, whether they're Hausa? What do you reckon?
This is a very good and very interesting question. And it's really the subject of a lot of debate within Nigeria or among Nigerians, merit versus, quote-unquote equity, right? Because the whole idea of this zoning or these ethnic identity, sectarian considerations, they are just to give everyone sort of a sense of belonging. Nigeria is an incredibly diverse country. But to be honest, sometimes I think this debate is premature, simply because historically, again, when you look at Nigeria, every major ethnic group, and even a lot of the quote-unquote minority groups, have complained about some sort of marginalization. Whoever is in power will be accused of marginalizing a certain section of the country or a certain ethnic group or a certain religion. And this is replicated across the states. A lot of the small groups complain of being dominated by the major groups. The thing is, without these sort of power sharing formulas, which are very complex, very messy sometimes, some of these smaller ethnic groups would not have the opportunity to be represented anywhere. So obviously, you know, with something as delicate as this, I think eventually among Nigerians, particularly the political elite, there needs to be a way of you know, standardizing this sort of power sharing formula, and probably having some sort of time limit to it, say 20 years or 30 years, you know, so that people understand that this is going to expire at some point. But then try and give everyone a sense of belonging. It's very, very difficult. But at the same time, I think sometimes it's a bit naive to just assume that merit is going to trump every other consideration or every other grievance or fears that people have, because these are real fears when you talk to people, particularly in the States.
So, Mark Anton, did you?
Very, very quick rejoinder on the religious vote or the ethnic vote. Let us remember that it happened in Nigeria during former elections, that you had a ticket with 2 Muslims, or you had, for instance, of course, the case of Abiola, was from the south. So it's not always this zoning that prevails. It can happen that there should be change. We'll see tomorrow with the APC primaries, but I don't have much hope in this regard.
Okay, the next question was for you, Elizabeth. It was, how is Nigeria helping the displaced, and what 3 things? Sorry, I can't remember who asked the question. Well, yeah, what 3 things should Nigeria be doing?
Yes, and thank you. Thank you for that question. Regardless of the actual cause of displacement, because you mentioned that we're talking Boko Haram or flooding, I think that the answers in terms of our own research are the same. We have to improve the information that we do have, because we're basing this on very rough estimates, and we have to improve the coordination that we're going to be using based on that information. So I mean, in terms of the information that we have, as I mentioned before, the figures are really all over the place, and each figure is complicated in Nigeria because stats are coming from different time periods. They're used alongside each other, and there's no systematic validation of updating figures. And I'll use the current figures of IDPs displaced by people displaced by Boko Haram as an example. We're using a figure now of 1.5 million people. Now, this is a figure that's just starting to trickle into the common parlance at the moment. Before that, we were using the figure of 646,000, which was based on an interagency assessment in May. Now, everyone knows we've seen an upscale of attacks. We've seen we've seen a significant displacement since May, but nonetheless, that was a figure that we were still basing our programmatic responses on until just a few weeks ago. So this is 646 to 1.5 million. That's twice as many people, but we were still basing our responses on something that was happening in a time frame of May. Now, what's important here is that NGOs who are working on the ground don't have the capacity to cross-check these figures in their area of operation. And there's, at the moment, no leadership from donors or the UN to undertake this, though there's a universal agreement that this is very badly needed. Again, these patterns of displacement are more important for programming purposes than for numbers, and we need to avoid this focus at the moment, which is explicitly dominated by needing to build capacity, which is an important issue, but we need to, more importantly, establish immediate coordination structures for information sharing so that we're getting the right resources to the right people at the right time.
Okay. Any more? Okay. Garbasani at the front with the beige suit.
So my name is Garbasani, the founding chairman of Foundation for Good Governance and Development in Nigeria. This question is more to Liz than anyone else. You made mention of the lack of sufficient and reliable information regarding the IDPs, as well as the ratification of the ratifying of the Kampala Convention by the government, but without putting it through to final, actually, really implementation. And given that of course, we're sitting here in the comfort of Chatham House talking about the internally displaced people and how they are going to vote and so on. in their minds, their priority is not about voting, it's not about who wins the next election. They are more concerned about their survival and their lives. And unfortunately, we have a president who has demonstrated without a doubt that he is not as concerned about Nigerians, especially so far away from his base and so far away from the action point. We have seen the division not only in religion, in sectional. His own party has been divided into two. A new PDP joined the APC. Governors Forum divided, and so on and so on. How much is he, you think, committed to really dealing with the issue of IDB, or is it just left to individual independent organizations to handle? Thank you.
Practice your diplomacy.
Well, yeah. I don't want to throw fuel on that fire, but I think that it's a valid question, and I think that a lot of people who are displaced at the moment are asking themselves the same thing. It's hard to ignore the fact on that map that a lot of the causes of displacement, be them human or disaster, are happening in the north. And so it's, if you're actually a person who has been affected by one of these causes, I could see how you were starting to feel forsaken at this point.
Okay, any other questions before I allow Renaud Mokri to respond to that one particular, okay, is that Adam Hijazi at the back there? Yeah.
On the figures from Oxford University, I think they're very interesting. Are they available anywhere? And can we have a look? 'Cause I think some of the analysis of the north-south, which states, getting into those figures could be really useful. I don't know if you have any more information, but getting into it would be really great. It would just sort of scratch the surface. So if there's any way to get that, I'll come and grab you afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Two things. First, we published some of the analysis in the Nigerian media and also on African arguments for an Royal African Society. But then we're going to produce a more comprehensive working paper in the next few days. But I can give you the link after the session.
Okay, now I'll allow Mr. Omokri to answer that particular criticism about, was it a Christian bias from Goodluck Jonathan? Was that the... I recall one. What was the other one? Okay, so if you can just answer those 2 points very, very briefly, please.
I'll be as brief as I can.
Okay. That's a bit ominous.
Now, on the issue of, I'll start with the issue of high incentive to manipulate results. And Zainab, you gave us evidence, or you cited the incidence of heavy security, and then you mentioned Ekiti. Now, your colleague, Dr. Olive Owen, he even agreed with me, and I'm glad Professor Kuna is here. It actually goes against what you're saying. The high level of security in Ekiti allowed for probably the highest voter turnout ever in Nigeria's history. People felt safe enough to come out to vote. So, I mean, that's not manipulating the process, that's helping the process. And we should have more of that, because when people don't feel safe, they're not going to come out to vote. Now, on the issue of the president being divisive because he visited Jerusalem and went on pilgrimage, I mean, that is not proof of the president's divisiveness. That is proof of the intolerance of his critics. In this country, the royal family, British prime ministers have gone to nations, Muslim nations like Saudi Arabia. Part of the things that they do there, they even go into mosques. There's nothing wrong with that. The president went on a state visit. He saw Benjamin Netanyahu. And then while he was there, he decided to participate in some of the events of the pilgrimage. There's nothing wrong with that. That is not proof of his being divisive. People who hold that view, that is actually proof of their being intolerant. And I'll say this. If you look at the people surrounding the president, this president has shown, I mean, a very, very, would I say, all the people surrounding him. Look at his national security advice.
Okay, I think you've made the point.
All right,
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Okay. All right. I think we will wrap now, unless anybody on the panel has anything else they'd like to say. Thank you very much for coming. This part of the session was completely on the record, I should have said earlier, but it's probably too late because you probably all tweeted everything anyone said anyway. But thank you for coming, and yeah, we all hope the elections will go through smoothly and that every vote will count. And I mean, we've had a few laughs here, but this is a very serious thing. I mean, I'm really, really for once, quite excited about this election. I can foresee some awful things happening, but at the same time, the fact that it is looking so much more open, and the fact that people are actually having the opportunity to speak directly to people like you and Ruben Abati and everybody else, I think is a really, really positive thing for Nigeria. And I think the fact that the big man politics seems to be on its way out of the country, if Buhari doesn't run, is only a positive thing for the country. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for your interest.